In 1952, when I was thinking about running for the United States Senate, I went to the then Senator Smathers and said, "George, what do you think?" He said, "Don't do it. Can't win. It's bad year." In 1956, I was at the Democratic Convention, and I said I didn't know whether I'd run for vice president or not. So I said, "George, what do you think? This is it. They need a young man. It's your chance." So I ran and lost. And in 1960, I was wondering whether I ought to run in the West Virginia primary. Don't do it. That state you can't possibly carry. And actually, the only time I really got nervous about the whole matter at Los Angeles was just before the balloting. George came up and said, "I think it looks pretty good for you."
I have therefore chosen this time and place to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth too rarely perceived, and that is the most important topic on earth: peace. What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. Those who came before us made certain that this country rode the first waves of the Industrial Revolution, the first waves of modern invention, and the first wave of nuclear power. And this generation does not intend to founder in the backwash of the coming age of space. We mean to be a part of it. We mean to lead it. For the communists rest everything on the idea of a monolithic world, a world where all knowledge has a single pattern. All societies move towards a single model, and all problems and roads have a single solution and a single destination. The pursuit of knowledge, on the other hand, rests everything on the opposite idea, on the idea of a world based on diversity, self-determination, freedom. And that is the kind of world to which we Americans as a nation are committed by the principles upon which the great republic was founded. We possess weapons of tremendous power, but they are least effective in combating the weapons most often used by freedom's foes: subversion, infiltration, guerrilla warfare, civil disorder. We send arms to other peoples, just as we send them the ideals of democracy in which we believe, but we cannot send them the will to use those arms or to abide by those ideals. And while we believe not only in the force of arms, but in the force of right and reason, we have learned that reason does not always appeal to unreasonable men. Nothing could more greatly damage our cause than if we and our allies were to believe that peace has already been achieved and that our strength and unity were no longer required. But now, for the first time in many years, the path of peace may be open. No one can be certain what the future will bring. No one can say whether the time has come for an easing of the struggle. But history and our own conscience will judge us harshly if we do not now make every effort to test our hopes by action. And this is the place to begin. According to the ancient Chinese proverb, a journey of 1,000 miles must begin with a single step. My fellow Americans, let us take that first step. Let us, if we can, step back from the shadows of war and seek out the way of peace. And if that journey is 1,000 miles, or even more, let history record that we, in this land, at this time, took the first step.
The president of a great democracy, such as ours, and the editors of great newspapers, such as yours, owe a common obligation to the people, an obligation to present the facts, to present them with candor, and to present them in perspective. It is with that obligation in mind that I have decided in the last 24 hours to discuss briefly at this time the recent events in Cuba. On that unhappy island, as in so many other arenas of the contest for freedom, the news has grown worse instead of better. I have emphasized before that this was a struggle of Cuban patriots against a Cuban dictator. While we could not be expected to hide our sympathies, we made it repeatedly clear that the armed forces of this country would not intervene in any way. Any unilateral American intervention, in the absence of an external attack upon ourselves or an ally, would have been contrary to our traditions and to our international obligations. But let the record show that our restraint is not inexhaustible. Should it ever appear that the inter-American doctrine of non-interference merely conceals or excuses a policy of non-action, if the nations of this hemisphere should fail to meet their commitments against outside communist penetration, then I want it clearly understood that this government will not hesitate in meeting its primary obligations, which are to the security of our nation. This is not the first time in either ancient or recent history that a small band of freedom fighters has engaged the armor of totalitarianism. It is not the first time that communist tanks have rolled over gallant men and women fighting to redeem the independence of their homeland. Nor is it by any means the final episode in the eternal struggle of liberty against tyranny anywhere on the face of the globe, including Cuba itself. Meanwhile, we will not accept Mr. Castro's attempts to blame this nation for the hatred which his one-time supporters now regard his repression. But there are, from this sobering episode, useful lessons for us all to learn. We dare not fail to see the insidious nature of this new and deeper struggle. We dare not fail to grasp the new concepts, the new tools, the new sense of urgency we will need to combat it, whether in Cuba or South Vietnam. And we dare not fail to realize that this struggle is taking place every day without fanfare in thousands of villages and markets, day and night, and in classrooms all over the globe. The message of Cuba, of Laos, of the rising din of communist voices in Asia and Latin America, these messages are all the same. The complacent, the self-indulgent, the soft societies are about to be swept away with the debris of history. Only the strong, only the industrious, only the determined, only the courageous, only the visionary who determine the real nature of our struggle can possibly survive. We intend to intensify our efforts for a struggle in many ways more difficult than war, where disappointment will often accompany us. For I am convinced that we in this country and in the free world possess the necessary resources and the skill and the added strength that comes from a belief in the freedom of man. And I am equally convinced that history will record the fact that this bitter struggle reached its climax in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. Let me then make clear, as the President of the United States, that I am determined upon our system's survival and success, regardless of the cost and regardless of the peril.
So all those who say that there's nothing left to be done, that we should rest on our oars, that the function of the national administration and government is to sit and lie at anchor, are wholly wrong, and we do not propose to follow their advice.
I have been informed that with this dinner, I am now responsible as the leader of the Democratic Party for a debt of only $1 million. Now, did anybody ever get a birthday present like that? $1 million. I don't know. They spent it like they were sure we were going to win. But I'm most grateful to you. This has been a series of shocks which you've endured on my behalf in 52, 58, the primaries, the election. And I'm sure you're wondering when it's all going to be over. But the great thing is, of course, it never ends. And we'll get this paid off, and then we'll start all over again.
All these arguments were made against Social Security at the time of Franklin Roosevelt. They're made today. The mail pours in, and at least half of the mail which I receive in the White House and on this issue and others is wholly misinformed. Last week I got 1,500 letters on a revenue measure, 1,494 opposed, and 6 for. And at least half of those letters were completely misinformed about the details of what they wrote. And why is that so? Because there are so many busy men in Washington who write. Some organizations have 600, 700, and 800 people spreading mail across the country, asking doctors and others to write in and tell your congressman you're opposed to it. The mail pours into the White House, into the Congress and Senator's office. Congressmen and senators feel people are opposed to it. Then they read a Gallup poll which says 75% of the people are in favor of it. And they say, what has happened to my mail? The point of the matter is that this meeting and the others indicates that the people of the United States recognize, one by one, thousand by thousand, million by million, that this is a problem whose solution is long overdue. And this year, I believe, or certainly as inevitably as the tide comes in next year, this bill is going to pass. This argument that the government should stay out, that it saps our pioneer stock. I used to hear that argument when we were talking about raising the minimum wage to $1.25. I remember one day being asked to step out into the hall. And up the corridor came 4 distinguished-looking men with straw hats on and canes. They told me they had just flown in from a state in their private plane, and they wanted me to know that if we passed a bill providing for time and a half for service station attendants, who were then working about 55 to 60 hours at straight time, it would sap their self-reliance. The fact of the matter is, what saps anyone's self-reliance is working 60 hours at straight time, or working at 85 or 95 or $1 an hour. Or depending upon filling out a pauper's oath and and then getting it free. Nobody in this hall is asking for it for nothing. They are willing to contribute during their working years. That is the important principle.
which has been lost sight of. I understand that there's going to be a program this week against this bill in which an English physician is going to come and talk about how bad their plans are. It may be, but he ought to talk about it in England. Because his plan and what they do in England is entirely different. In England, the entire cost of medicine for people of all ages, all of it, doctors, the choice of doctors, hospitals, from the time you're born to the time you die, are included in a government program. But what we're talking about is entirely different. And I hope that while he's here, he and Dr. Spock and others who have joined us will come to see what we're trying to do. The fact of the matter is that what we are now talking about doing, most of the countries of Europe did years ago. The British did it 30 years ago. We are behind every country pretty nearly in Europe in this matter of medical care for our citizens. And then finally, I had a letter last week saying you're going to take care of all the millionaires and they don't need it. I do not know how many millionaires we are talking about, but they won't mind contributing $12 a month to Social Security, and they may be among those who will apply for it when they go to the hospital. But what I will say is that the national government, through the tax laws, already takes care of them, because over 65 they can deduct all their medical expenses. What we are concerned about is the person not who has not got a cent, but those who saved and worked and then get hit. Then there are those who say, well, what happens if you die before you're 65? Well, there isn't. You really don't care. You have no guarantees. But what we are talking about is our people are living a long time. Their housing is inadequate. In many cases, their rehabilitation is inadequate. We've got great unfinished business in this country. And while this bill does not solve our problems in this area, I do not believe it is a valid argument to say this bill isn't going to do the job. It will not. But it will do part of it. Our housing bill last year for the elderly, that won't do the job, but it will begin. When we retrain workers, that won't take care of unemployment chronically in some areas, but it's a start. We aren't able overnight to solve all the problems that this country faces. But is that any good reason why we should say, let's not even try? That's what we're going to do today. We are trying. We are trying.
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the Scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay? 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free. We preach freedom around the world, and we mean it. And we cherish our freedom here at home. But are we to say to the world, and much more importantly, to each other, that this is a land of the free, except for the Negroes, that we have no second-class citizens, except Negroes, that we have no class or caste system, no ghettos, no master race, except with respect to Negroes? Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise. the events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them. I heard the old saying that you spend the first 6 months in the House of Representatives wondering how you got there, and the next 6 months wondering how everybody else got there. I spent the first 6 months as expected, but I must say that I never wondered how Congressman Thomas got there. It's always been clear to me. When I read the report that Congressman Thomas was thinking of resigning, I called him up on the phone and asked him to stay as long as I stayed. I didn't know how long that would be, but I wanted him to stay. I don't think our party in this century has ever been led by men who have promised a soft and easy existence. What they have promised, and their names and their slogans distinguish them, Wilson and Roosevelt and Truman, that the word American, the title citizen of the United States, would be an honorable one and one marked by respect and dignity. And it is to that end that the new frontier is committed. In the 1920s, Marshal Lyautey, the distinguished French marshal, told his gardener to plant a tree, and the gardener said, well, you don't want to plant that. It's going to take 100 years to flower. And he said, in that case, plant it this afternoon. Well, we don't know whether it will take 100 years to flower, and it may never flower, but I think we ought to plant it tonight. Thank you.
I've been making nonpartisan speeches all day, and I'm glad to come here as a Democrat and express my pleasure as being Democrat. If there are any Republicans here, this is the Democratic message that I'm about to give. I want to give them fair warning. Woodrow Wilson once said that a political party is of no use unless it's serving a great national purpose. I believe that the Democratic Party in this century has served a great national purpose here in the state of Florida, here in this county, and here in the United States.
I spoke a year ago today to take the inaugural, and I'd like to paraphrase a couple of statements I made that day by saying that we observe tonight not a celebration of freedom, but a victory of party. For we are sworn to pay off the same party debt our forebears ran up nearly a year and 3 months ago. Our deficit will not be paid off in the next 100 days, nor will it be paid off in the first 1,000 days, nor in the life of this administration, nor perhaps even in our lifetime on this planet, but let us begin. Remembering that generosity is not a sign of weakness, and that ambassadors are always subject to Senate confirmation. For if the Democratic Party cannot be helped by the many who are poor, it cannot be saved by the few who are rich. So let us begin. To Jack Benny, who came to help an older man, to Danny Kaye, who I talked to today in a hospital, to Harry Belafonte. I don't feel so sorry about him, though, because he interrupted his tour in Columbus, Ohio. And I can tell you that there is no city in the United States where a Democrat gets a warmer welcome and less votes than Columbus, Ohio. We're grateful to Ella Fitzgerald. I don't know whether you realize that this is an historic occasion. We have paid off the nearly $4 billion that the Kennedy Johnson ticket ran up in November of 1960. It is now gone forever, which is sad, and all we have left is the federal deficit. But we want you to know, Miss Fitzgerald, who came to our gala before the inaugural and helped us on that occasion, Henry Fonda, who has helped us before and after the election, Maria Callas, who came all the way from Europe. She said to Ms. Rosenberg that she came from Brooklyn. Her father works for the mayor in the City of New York service, and we are very complimented by your coming so far to help us out. To Elliott Reed, since he imitated me, and I have comparatively little talent, I would like to recall a speech which Franklin Roosevelt made in 1944 in regard to his dog. He said, "These Republican leaders have not been content with attacks on me, on my wife, or my brothers. No, not content with that, they now include my little girl's pony, Macaroni." Well, I don't resent such attacks, but Macaroni does. Actually, there's another speech given by a former Vice President of the United States in 1952, which is even more pertinent. It was just a little pony, and you know the kids, like all kids, loved it. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep it. And I'm glad to be here with the Vice President. When I was away recently, somebody called the White House and said, "I'd like to speak to the President." And they said, "Well, he's in Canada." "Well, we'd like to speak to the Vice President." And they said, "Well, he's in Southeast Asia." "Well, then I'd like to speak to the Secretary of State." They said, "Well, he was in Geneva." "Well," they said, "who's running that store?" And the operator said, "The same man who's been running it for years, Sam Rayburn." I will say on becoming president that the only thing that really surprised us when we got into office was that things were just as bad as we'd been saying they were. Otherwise, we've been enjoying it very much. In 1783, the first American official to visit France, Benjamin Franklin, signed in Paris the treaty declaring that His Britannic Majesty acknowledges the United States to be free, sovereign, and independent. When we became free, sovereign, and independent, there was a King of France, a Tsar of Russia, an Emperor in Peking. They've all gone, and this country remains. Today, 178 years later, I return to the place where the United States was born. And my trip next week, the ground for that trip was laid in the administration of a predecessor of mine, Harry Truman, whose vision and activity in the 1940s helped make it possible to build a Europe which is our strong ally in difficult days. And it is my judgment that when the time comes to write the story of the 20th century, the dominant fact will be that liberty grew and spread around the world. And that's why I go to Europe with confidence and hope, because the United States is associated with that great cause. For all I've been reading in the last 3 or 4 or 5 months about the great conservative revival that's sweeping the United States, I thought that perhaps no one was going to show up today. But I'm proud to be here today, and proud to be among those of you who not only in the future but today help make the program of the Democratic Party. Artemus Ward once said about 50 years ago, "I'm not a politician, and my other habits are good also." We are politicians, and we believe in the sense that we recognize that a political party is not an end in itself, but is a means of making progress for the American people. What use is either one of our two great political parties if they really represent to those who are active in them only a means of expression and exercise? They are important, they are functional, they will endure only as they contribute to the well-being of the people of this country. And all those I read a good deal, as do you, about all the slogans for the solutions of our problems that sweep across the United States. And slogans are important, particularly if they tell something about what's behind them. But what I think we must hear from the political leaders of our two parties is not slogans attempting to invoke old memories of self-reliance and all the rest. What we really want to know is, how can the United States maintain its strength, maintain the peace, maintain full employment, improve the life of our people, spread its influence around the world, strengthen the cause of freedom, survive, endure, and prevail? And it is to these great questions, which are today far more complicated than they were in the days even of Franklin Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson, that we as Democrats and those of us who are active in our party and in our country must address ourselves to. Not merely to mouth the old slogans and the old programs. How can the United States maintain full employment in a free economy and in a free society? A recession in 58, a recession in 60, a recession in 54, a recession in 49. Is this recovery now, which in the last 6 or 7 months has seen the American economy move forward by over 10%, is this economy going to run out of gas again at the end of 62 or 63 or 64? I think the problems pour upon us. And these are problems that can be met, but I think they can only be met by those who are willing to do the hard work and come up with the hard solutions. And I believe that it's incumbent upon all of us who are interested in our country, all of us who are active in political life, to attempt to come forward, and most of all you, who will be the leaders of this country, who have the longest to look forward to, who will be active over the next 40 years, and who therefore must live with the results of all the judgments that we make today. What is this country and the world going to be like in 1970 and 80 and 90? When we see atomic weapons proliferate around the world, missiles and all the rest, you're going to be living in the most hazardous period, of course, of the human race. Can the peace be maintained? Can our strength be increased? Can the chances of freedom prosper? So I come here today not merely to make an old-time political speech, but I come here because I believe the opportunity and the obligation upon you is great. The Democratic Party is the oldest political party in the world, and the reason it's old is because from the time of Jefferson to the present day, the Democratic Party has been realistic enough to recognize the kind of problems which are coming over the horizon in the years ahead, and has had programs and policies to meet them. And if there is anything and the day that we have not, the day that the Democratic Party is not prepared to come forward with those programs and policies, regardless of our old memories and our old leaders, we will fade as the Whig Party faded and made way for the Republican Party. A political party is like anything else in life. It's the survival of the fittest. And the fittest in American life today are those who look realistically at the challenges and attempt to move this country forward. We can keep going by not merely invoking the past, but by using the past as a stimulus to the future. And all of the great leaders of the Democratic Party, Wilson's New Freedom, Roosevelt's New Deal, Truman's Fair Deal, and our new frontier, our attempts to pick the United States up and move it.
I first of all want to express my appreciation to my brother Teddy for his offering me his coattails. Teddy's been down in Washington, and he came to see me the other day, and he said he's really tired of being referred to as the younger brother of the president and being another Kennedy, and it's crowded in Washington, and that he was going to break loose and change his name. He was going out on his own. Instead of being Teddy Kennedy now, he's changing it. It's Teddy Roosevelt. He's running. My last campaign, I suppose, may be coming up very shortly. But Teddy's around, and therefore these dinners can go on indefinitely.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. Every newspaper now asks itself, with respect to every story, is it news? All I suggest is that you add the question, is it in the interest of national security? And I hope that every group in America, unions and businessmen and public officials at every level, will ask the same question of their endeavors and subject their actions to this same exacting test. I not only could not stifle controversy among your readers, I welcome it. This administration intends to be candid about its errors. For as a wise man once said, an error doesn't become a mistake until you refuse to correct it. We intend to accept full responsibility for our errors, and we expect you to point them out when we miss them. Without debate, without criticism, no administration and no country can succeed, and no republic can survive.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. This urgent transformation of Cuba into an important strategic base by the presence of these large, long-range, and clearly offensive weapons of sudden mass destruction constitutes an explicit threat to the peace and security of all the Americas, in flagrant and deliberate defiance of the Rio Pact of 1947, the traditions of this nation and hemisphere, the joint resolution of the 87th Congress, the Charter of the United Nations, and my own public warnings to the Soviets on September 4th and 13th. This action also contradicts the repeated assurances of Soviet spokesmen, both publicly and privately delivered, that the arms buildup in Cuba would retain its original defensive character. This sudden, clandestine decision to station strategic weapons for the first time outside of Soviet soil is a deliberately provocative and unjustified change in the status quo, which cannot be accepted by this country if our courage and our commitments are ever to be trusted again by either friend or foe. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. Our resolution will call for the prompt dismantling and withdrawal of all offensive weapons in Cuba under the supervision of UN observers before the quarantine can be lifted. My fellow citizens, let no one doubt that this is a difficult and dangerous effort on which we have set out. No one can foresee precisely what course it will take, or what costs or casualties will be incurred. Many months of sacrifice and self-discipline lie ahead, months in which both our patience and our will be tested, months in which many threats and denunciations will keep us aware of our dangers. But the greatest danger of all would be to do nothing. The path we have chosen for the present is full of hazards, as all paths are. But it is the one most consistent with our character and courage as a nation and our commitments around the world. The cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it. And one path we shall never choose, and that is the path of surrender or submission. Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere. And we hope around the world, God willing, that goal will be achieved.
1 year ago at this time, I came into this city around dark after having made about 15 stump speeches. In the last 9 months, I'm happy to say that this is the first stump speech I've made for a candidate, and I'm glad it's here in New Jersey. I am somewhat out of practice, but I will say that the last time I came to New Jersey was just after Mr. Nixon had turned down the 5th debate. And I gather that Mr. Mitchell feels that no Republican should ever be caught in a debate again. I was interested the other day to see where Mr. Nixon suggested that Governor Rockefeller and Senator Goldwater should engage in some debates. I wish he would come over here and suggest that Mr. Mitchell stand up and debate Judge Hughes on the problems of New Jersey.
I want to express my pleasure at being back from whence I came. There is an impression in Washington that there are no Kennedys left in Ireland, that they're all in Washington. And so I wonder if there are any Kennedys in this audience. Could you hold up your hand and so I can see? Well, I'm glad to see a few cousins who didn't catch the boat. We're glad to... I know now why everyone in Texas, Fort Worth, is so thin, having gotten up and down about 9 times. This is what you do every morning. Mr. Buck, Mr. Vice President, Governor Conley, Senator Yarborough, Jim Wright, members of the congressional delegation, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Attorney General, ladies and gentlemen. 2 years ago, I said that, introduced myself in Paris by saying that I was the man who had accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris. I'm getting that same sensation as I travel around Texas. Nobody wonders what Lyndon and I wear.
I'm glad to be here in Jim Wright City. About 35 years ago, a congressman from California, just been elected, received a letter from an irate constituent which said, during your campaign you promised to have the Sierra Madre Mountains reforested. You've been in office for 1 month and you haven't done so. Well, no one in Fort Worth has been that unreasonable, but in some ways he has had the Sierra Madre Mountains reforested. And here in Fort Worth, he's contributed to its growth. He speaks for Fort Worth. He speaks for the country. And I don't know any city that's better represented in the Congress of the United States than Fort Worth. And in the not-too-distant future, a new Fort Worth product. And I'm glad that there was a table separating Mr. Hicks and myself. A new Fort Worth product. The TFX, Tactical Fighter Experimental. Nobody knows what those words mean, but that's what they mean. Tactical Fighter Experimental will serve the forces of freedom and will be the #1 airplane in the world today. There's been a good deal of discussion of the long and hard-fought competition to win the TFX contract, but very little discussion about what this plane will do. It will be the first operational aircraft ever produced that can literally spread its wings through the air. It will thus give us a single plane capable of carrying out missions of speed as well as distance, able to fly very far in one form or very fast in another. It can take off from rugged, short airstrips, enormously increasing the Air Force's ability to participate in limited wars. The same basic plane will serve the Navy's carriers, saving the taxpayers at least $1 billion in cost if they built separate planes for the Navy and the Air Force. The government of Australia, by purchasing $125 million of TFX planes before they are even off the drawing board, has already testified to the merit of this plane, and at the same time, it's confident in the ability of Fort Worth to meet its schedule. In all these ways, the success of our national defense depends upon this city in the western United States, 10,000 miles from Vietnam, 5,000 or 6,000 miles from Berlin, thousands of miles from trouble spots in Latin America and Africa or the Middle East. And yet Fort Worth and what it does and what it produces participates in all these great historic events. Texas as a whole and Fort Worth bear particular responsibility for this national defense effort. For military procurement in this state totals nearly $1.25 billion, fifth highest among all the states of the Union. There are more military personnel on active duty in this state than any in the nation save one. And it's not Massachusetts. Any in the nation save one with a combined military-civilian defense payroll of well over $1 billion. I don't recite these for any partisan purpose. They're the result of American determination to be second to none. And as a result of the effort which this country has made in the last 3 years, we are second to none. In the past 3 years, we have increased the defense budget of the United States by over 20%, increased the program of acquisition for Polaris submarines from 24 to 41, increased our Minuteman missile purchase program by more than 75%, doubled the number of strategic bombers and missiles on alert, doubled the number of nuclear weapons available in the strategic alert forces, increased the tactical nuclear forces deployed in Western Europe by over 60%, added 5 combat-ready divisions to the armies of the United States and 5 tactical fighter wings to the Air Force of the United States, increased our strategic airlift capability by 75%, and increased our special counterinsurgency forces, which are engaged now in South Vietnam, by 600%. I hope those who want a strong America and place it on some signs will also place those figures next to it. This is not an easy effort. This requires sacrifice by the people of the United States. But this is a very dangerous and uncertain world. As I said earlier, on 3 occasions in the last 3 years, the United States has had a direct confrontation. No one can say when it will come again. No one expects that our life will be easy. Certainly not in this decade, and perhaps not in this century. But we should realize what a burden and responsibility the people of the United States have borne for so many years. Here, a country which lived in isolation, divided and protected by the Atlantic and the Pacific, uninterested in the struggles of the world around it. Here, in the short space of 18 years after the Second World War, we put ourselves by our own will and by necessity into defensive alliances with countries all around the globe. Without the United States, South Vietnam would collapse overnight. Without the United States, the CETO alliance would collapse overnight. Without the United States, the CENTO alliance would collapse overnight. Without the United States, there would be no NATO, and gradually Europe would drift into neutralism and indifference. Without the effort of the United States and the Alliance for Progress, the communist advance onto the mainland of South America would long ago have taken place. So this country, which desires only to be free, which desires to be secure, which desires to live at peace for 18 years under 3 different administrations, has borne more than its share of the burden, has stood watch for more than its number of years. I don't think that we are fatigued or tired. We would like to live as we once lived, but history will not permit it. The communist balance of power is still strong. The balance of power is still on the side of freedom. We are still the keystone and the arch of freedom, and I think we will continue to do as we have done in our past, our duty, and the people of Texas will be in the lead. So I'm glad to come. I'm glad to come to this state which has played such a significant role in so many efforts in this century, and to say that here in Fort Worth, you people will be playing a major role in the maintenance of the security of the United States for the next 10 years. I'm confident, as I look to the future, that our chances for security, our chances for peace, are better than they've been in the past. And the reason is because we're stronger. And with that strength is a determination to not only maintain the peace, but also the vital interests of the United States. To that great cause, Texas and the United States are committed. Thank you.